Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Alex Dalziel. He is the senior fellow or a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Alex, want to just sort of bear down a little bit on some of the context of this. What are the legal grounds for Russian expansion? What do they claim in terms of legal rights, and where does that come from?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Russian Federation is a signatory to the UN Law of the Sea. So Russia, as well as Canada and Denmark, have been involved in a multi-year process to what's called delimit, basically set the boundaries for in the Arctic Ocean. Now, this has to do with the continental shelf and special rules that apply. If you can show the continental shelf extends from the terrestrial, you can get beyond the 12 and 200 mile limits that we're more familiar with to have jurisdiction. Now, jurisdiction doesn't mean you control it; just means that you have kind of first rights to resource exploitation, and so on. So, because Russia was a bit ahead of the game over the last 2 decades almost, science has been the guide here. There's a special body at the United Nations to which you submit your scientific claims, and they basically judge whether those scientific claims have merit. So Russia's have been deemed to have merit, and those extend way, way up into the north. Canada's and Denmark's claims will take a few more years, probably till around 2030 before all that's cleared. But the really important thing to remember is all the UN is doing here is saying, yeah, your science is good. So this may shape the parameters of any discussion if Canada's science doesn't justify what we've claimed, which has also been quite expansive, doesn't justify what Denmark, through the territory of Greenland, has claimed. Then the Russians could find themselves in a very strong position. If there's overlap, which is quite possible, the science isn't political, of course. I mean, whatever the territory of the bottom of the ocean is what it is. Then it goes into basically bilateral negotiations. And I think that's the part to keep in mind, that nothing is determined here by the UN, but will ultimately be determined between Ottawa, Moscow.
Yeah, so let's talk about Canada a little bit more then. So what is Canada's stance on all this, and what is Canada's strategy?
Sorry, Canada's stance on
these claims by Russia, Denmark, and the U.S., for example, and then what's our strategy to advance those claims?
Absolutely. So again, I mean, the official strategy is to follow the process under the Law of the Sea, and to treat these in turn. So to some extent, there's a bit of a hiatus right now while we wait for this UN body to rule on this quality of our science. What we're doing, though, to be ready is maybe somewhat of a good question. We have taken a number of positive steps, I think, in Canada to improve our ability in the Arctic, even in the last couple of years, with the announcement, primarily under the mantle of NORAD, so the North American Aerospace Defense Structure, to improve our radars. We've taken some steps in the Navy to actually have some ice-capable warships, very lightly armed, but nonetheless expanding the season in which the Royal Canadian Navy can be present. And of course, very important announcements around finally buying the F-35 fighter, creating some of the basing, et cetera, up there. But Senate and parliamentary reports have done a good job in highlighting some of the challenges we face, which primarily still have to do with situational awareness. So this is the issue of sensors, being able to detect things, whether they're on the land, whether they're on the water, whether they're in the air, and increasingly whether they're in space, that can affect the Arctic. The Arctic, what I haven't mentioned so far, of course, historically, the Arctic was primarily seen as almost a corridor for threat to reach southern Canada and the continental United States. And this had to do with the Russian strategic nuclear arsenal, which is primarily based, or is heavily based in parts of their north. And so dealing with those threats, and as been announced over the years, the Russians, continue to publicize these sorts of novel threats with some new capabilities. So it was understood that NORAD needed to improve its radar. What I think we're going to see over the next 20 years, though, and you need to have a fairly long time limit here, and there's good reasons to be thinking about these now, is that as the sea ice melts, there's going to be more possibility for things in the maritime domain in particular. So NORAD has some capabilities there, but certainly not where they need them to be, and it should be something that we augment. over the next 20 years. And maybe I'll just conclude that thought by saying, the threat level remains low to Canada in the Arctic right now. But as we've seen with procurement, and particularly for building bases, et cetera, like the Nanisivik refueling station that was initially announced during the Harper years,
Right.
I mean, it's still not completely operational.
Right.
So if we don't get ahead on some of these questions, it's not a matter of dealing this when the threat is there, it's a matter of being ready in advance.
We're going to take another break with our guests. We'll be back after these messages. Please stay with us.